We have four colleagues that I think are wonderful. Many of you may know them, and some of you may have just read about them or heard them. And as today's moderator, my role is to get out of the way so you can hear from them. I believe that each one of them are active participants and contributors to USF's Jesuit mission and identity. And what I've asked for each of them to do in meeting with them beforehand was to ask them to be respondents to the single query, which is, please comment in only a way that they could on the intersection and the intersectionality of USF's Jesuit Catholic mission and gender and sexuality. So you can imagine they probably like, what do you want us to say, Mary? What do you want us to do? So what I asked them to do was to bring their stories. I asked them to bring in personal narratives based upon their own or others' lived experience. I've asked them to bring in their scholarship if they've engaged in scholarship and any other professional experiences that they've had at USF, personally or professionally, in engaging faculty, students, or others around the mission. And so I'd like to, I'm going to introduce each one as we kind of move through. And the format that I like to do today is to give each of our colleagues opportunity to respond to that query that I had for them. And then, if possible, if you can jot down your thoughts and your questions and that in the moment and even after they finished, allow me to introduce the next individual and allow all four of them to go through. And then with Katie's support and help, begin to hopefully do an engaging facilitation. Our goal is to finish up at 1 o'clock because we know that many of you will have other meetings and things to do. So does that sound like a good protocol for us? Okay, so Professor Vincent Pizzuto, I'm going to start with you, okay? He is a professor of Catholic Studies and Social Thought in our Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He has a PhD. Where do you have a PhD from? There it goes. But I've worked with Vincent on a multitude of issues, particularly even before I was in the diversity role when I was Dean of Students, when we were dealing with some tough issues that had any implications around gender and sexuality, whether it had to do with gender-neutral housing or facilities and policies and perspectives for students and others on campus. Vincent was somebody that I would consult with. And so Vincent, I'd like for you to kind of share in your response from a kind of a theological perspective, the intersectionality of gender and sexuality. You've been at USF for a number of years. You clearly teach in the theology department. You're a reverend, and you've written a lot about this in your scholarship. If you can kind of like respond to the intersectionality of gender and sexuality as it relates to our Jesuit Catholic mission.
Okay, well, thank you. So 2 points that I want to start with, because they're important for what I'll say in just a few minutes, is that the University of San Francisco has been, as an institution, unimaginably supportive of the work that I've done. Sometimes I published in areas dealing with homosexuality in the church and have I found myself somewhat in hot water, church investigations and so forth, that the university has been very, very supportive of. That's a very important element because it has given me the ability to not only think critically about the intersection that Mary's asking us about, but to think critically about my own assumptions about those questions. And so just if you would hold that in mind. I teach a course known as the Homosexuality in the Bible. It is, as you might imagine in San Francisco, a very popular course, and often unexpected in terms of what the students derive from it. I begin the course with an essay that looks at the foundational basis between what we might think of as progressive or liberal hermeneutics and more conservative hermeneutics, hermeneutics being sort of the lens through which we interpret texts or interpret life, etc. And what I try to point out is that when we're engaged in debates, often about sexuality and so forth, we're not dealing with the underlying hermeneutical lenses. We're not dealing with all of the perspectives and lenses that each of us who's debating the issue is coming from. Yeah? So we end up arguing on a level, what is really a surface level, without getting to the underwriting motives for those positions. Okay? So there's a tension that we can identify. And we see this clearly between church and society, and I think enshrined in the University of San Francisco and the church as sort of opposing ideas. And that is this: is the issue around gender and sexuality, be it gay marriage or a host of issues around homosexuality and so forth, is that a sexual ethics issue, which the church would argue that it is, or is it a civil rights and social justice issue, which is the predominant hermeneutical lens that the University of San Francisco seems to approach this, right? And if we don't understand that church and university have underlying foundational differences in how we come at this question, we can't get to the root of the disagreement, okay? So I try first and foremost to address that question with my class, because I don't assume perspectives with which the students are coming into the class. And I want to certainly create an environment where we can have theological discourse, honest discourse, and not merely ideological spouting of various positions. So to give an example, several years ago in teaching the course, I had a heterosexual male student who was in ROTC who came to me during office hours to complain that I was being too critical of the gay community and not critical enough with the church. And I thought, only in San Francisco could this happen, a gay professor being criticized by a ROTC student. And what I tried to convey to him was that it is precisely in an atmosphere that USF has provided me as a scholar to think through these ideas that I've been able to think through the potential limitations of my ideas. And much earlier in the course of my life, my inability to really dialogue meaningfully with people who held different views. And we all know how easy it is to cast aspersions in either direction. If you don't agree with my views on gay marriage or homosexuality, then you're clearly homophobic, and there's no other explanation for it. I've taken the last 5 years or so to engage intentionally with community partners who are out of evangelical and conservative hermeneutical churches. And they have extended bridges to me, and I have to them. And what's fascinating out of that is the conversations. There is a profound lack of agreement on the ultimate conclusion of where we stand on these issues. But nevertheless, we have formed real, honest friendships. And what I would like to suggest is that we as a university, because of our very clear perspectives, I think we can say around the block on this issue, that we learn how to engage the other. And I've been able to do it precisely because of the unwavering support that I've gotten from the university. And in engaging the other, engaging those who in previous years I might have demonized and vice versa, it's an amazing process of how we learn, as Paul would say in his letter to the Romans, to receive one another. Romans 14 through 15 provides a beautiful model where he talks about weaker and stronger members of faith communities. And he's addressing a very diverse set of house churches at the time in Rome, coming from Gentile or Jewish communities, both converting to Christianity, who had immensely huge differences between them about what it meant to live the Christian life and how that ought to be done with regards to Sabbath observances or kosher laws and so forth. Things that we don't regard necessarily as important today, but to the early church were. And what he says is, how do you receive one another? How do we allow space for the other to hold on to their positions long enough for an honest discourse, an honest dialogue to unfold, to allow each to first receive one another, to humanize one another, rather than otherize the person? And I think that USF is in a unique role where we could actually do this. And we're, in a sense, forced to do it because we are founded on a faith community that looks at the issue of gender and sexuality as very different than the social justice or civil rights perspective that has dominated our classrooms and our literature and the things that we're publishing and so forth and so on. So how do we engage in that kind of dialogue with the church? A contemporary example we might think of is looking at the now very quickly beloved Pope Francis, who seems to be melting the hearts of just millions of people around the world. It's important to realize something. As best we can tell so far, theologically, Francis is not different on his positions on issues of homosexuality and gender are no different than his predecessors. What's different is his tone. What's different is the degree of humility at which he's coming to these questions and bringing them to his papacy. That's what we love about him. So how do we bring a degree of humility with our own positions into conversations with those who might also disagree? On both sides of the spectrum, you have rigid, unyielding people who hold ideological positions that are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to break. But there's a huge spectrum in between, a more moderate, conservative, and liberal hermeneutic that can and ought to be in dialogue with one another. Francis, as some of you may know, is posing a question to the church. He's sending around questionnaires around the world. Two of those questions, if I can, one being what pastoral attention can be given to people who live in same-sex unions? Another question that will be coming to the church, in the case of unions of persons of the same sex who have adopted children, what can be done pastorally in light of transmitting the faith? This is huge for a papacy who remains relatively conservative about the issue of homosexuality and certainly continues to see this issue as one of sexual ethics and not civil rights. This is a huge stretch. So how do we, in return, begin to listen to hear, to try to dialogue with these kinds of perspectives? Okay, so I'll sort of throw those out there as kind of beginning foundation points and then see what questions come back. Okay, thank you.
So before she speaks, this is Professor Elizabeth J. Friedman, Latin American Studies as well as International Studies as her department. And one of the things that I found interesting about her scholarship is that she has worked with women in Latin American countries and that have experienced perhaps policies or doctrine of the Catholic Church that perhaps has not been allowed them to be whole, that's my own interpretation. And so her scholarship has really looked at transnational women organizing, American feminism and civil society at both regional and global levels, but she's currently exploring the impact of new global technologies on Latin American gender equality organizing. And so, Professor Friedman, share a little bit about the narratives that you have witnessed and documented as you've heard from others in your work.
Thank you. I want to start with just a small correction, which is that actually my home and, as they say, my tenure line is in politics. No, that's fine. I just have to make sure we're present. And I also really want to acknowledge the privilege it is for me to address this audience, because I am aware just of I probably know about 20% of you, but I know you are the people who make my life here at the university possible, and you make the lives of our students here at the university possible, and I should be listening to you, but I really appreciate you coming out to have this conversation with us, and to Mary and Julia and others for creating yet another space on this amazing campus for deep reflection about mission, what we're all doing here, and how we can do it better together. I guess I want to start by just offering a personal reflection as a person of gender and a person of sexuality, in terms of what it was like for me to experience Jesuit mission when I first came on campus for my interview here. And I had the privilege of being interviewed by the now provost, then dean, Jenny Turpin, who, while we got into sort of the more personal aspects of what it would be like for me to be on campus, reassured me that my female partner would have health benefits should I be employed at the University of San Francisco. What she didn't know at the time that I sat on her beautiful sofa was that I was also thinking about the fate of the twins that were gestating inside my womb, who would also be coming onto the USF medical insurance. But when she explained to me that at this Catholic institution there was something called legally domiciled adults who could be on your health insurance, and that I found out later the LDA benefits extended not only to same-sex partners, but also to other adults that might live in your household who would need medical insurance because they couldn't get it for various reasons, your adult children, perhaps your aging parents. I understood, you know, as I was here for a little bit longer, that that had to do with a extraordinary perspective on the world that was rooted in Jesuit mission, that really did think about our lives in a more holistic way. I also got more of the backstory about how LDAs came to this Catholic institution. At the time, I understood it was the only Catholic institution in the United States of America that effectively would extend health care benefits to same-sex partners of their employees. And that was a real political struggle that happened here on campus, but that it happened in such a way that, I can't repeat what Vince has explained to us, but that allowed these two hermeneutic frames to come together to offer very important material benefits to the community. So I was very impressed by that. Jenny also let slip that for whatever reason, she happened to be hiring lots of gay men and lesbians just because they were the best people for the job. I found that immensely reassuring. I knew that I was interviewing for a position in San Francisco, but again, and here I'll sort of segue into my research, I was nervous as a feminist scholar what it would be like to be inside the belly of the beast, right? Everyone was like, but it's Catholic, Elizabeth, it's Catholic. What does this mean for you? What does it mean, since you're a scholar of feminist social movements in Latin America who have as one of their primary goals the right to choose, what would it mean for your scholarship and your teaching if you were to join this particular community? So I'll get back to that in a moment, but I did want to acknowledge what it was like personally to come into this community. For about 20 years, I have been studying Latin American feminist and increasingly queer movements in Venezuela, a little bit in Central America, and then dominantly in Argentina. And possibly some of you know that Argentina is one of the 10 countries around the world that at the national level has provided for same-sex marriage. And they did that through statute. That wasn't from the decisions of the courts. So it was something that, if you believe in representative democracy, and that's a whole conversation, if you'd like to go with me after this to class, we can have. But it was tremendous to have it decided in that way. And I was privileged to be able to interview some of the central people involved in the same-sex marriage campaign in Argentina. And like many other campaigns that social movements, the kind of social movements that I study in Latin America are involved in, it was very clear that the majority of the opposition to this statute was coming directly from the Catholic hierarchy. That was something that I was not surprised by, again, that had resonated through all of the work that I've done looking at these social movements, that over and over again, as they've put forward their demands for autonomy, bodily autonomy, control over bodies, for the right to love the person you are most infatuated with and have that right recognized by the state under whose rules you are forced to conform, that over and over again it was the Catholic hierarchy that would fund, that would very explicitly get involved in the opposition to these movements and their demands. What I was not expecting to find was a counter discourse, if you were, coming from various people of faith, including dissident priests within the Catholic hierarchy, that, if you were, again, started to not move their hermeneutic frame, but to understand how the texts, and here I'm going to smile at Loie, the texts that this very same Catholic hierarchy was basing their opposition to could also reveal an alternative way of understanding the demands of people to be, again, have their families recognized. And I was very moved by that, but I also saw real resonance with the history of organizing in Latin America because so much of that was touched by Vatican II and the progressive theology that came out of that time of the development of the Catholic Church. And so it was quite wonderful to see that come together in a struggle that basically just concluded in 2010. And I have seen that before coming through organizations like Catholics for the Right to Choose, which is very active in Latin America. And I was reminded about what it was like to have, to hear women of very deep Catholic faith reference that faith in their struggles for women's autonomy, because it resonates with the mission of the university ministry here at the University of San Francisco. Because the university ministry wants to inspire members of the USF community to experience inner freedom, realize the fullness of their humanity, and live lives of hope, passion, integrity, and purpose. And that is a wonderful way of understanding, for example, how Catholic feminists do their work in Latin America. So I'll just conclude with one more anecdote in case this is something that people want to open up in this space, which is that like Vincent, I have felt very supported and never criticized in terms of personally what I have done in my classrooms or what I've published, the orientation of my publishing. I felt very supported at the university level. But I do have one anecdote to close on, and that is something that happened when I was co-coordinating the Global Women's Rights Forum. And one year we had a panel on women's health care, in which we brought in women from the Bay Area, physicians, people who study women's health care, sociologists, people who are involved in disseminating it at the grassroots, to talk about what was going on with feminist health care, and particularly this was around the discussion of Obamacare, any insights they had into that. So we set up this panel, we were so excited by it, and lo and behold, coming through my email were, and these people shall remain anonymous, but email from inside, very high up in the administration, with concerns because a local Catholic website had begun to publish that the University of San Francisco was inviting a bunch of abortion promoters to campus to display their, I don't know, their interest in the baby Holocaust. And it was that panel that I had worked so hard to bring together. And I was getting questions from inside the university about whether this was really what we were going to do with this panel. How could this be possible? And I won't tell you how I responded, but I will tell you that I took a deep breath and I sat back in my chair and I thought, think of all the people in Latin America you've talked to who have had a much harder time trying to negotiate what it means to be Catholic or means to live in a predominantly Catholic society and deal with this kind of issue. You are at one with them right now, and just as they have, you have to figure out how to engage your institution with feminist integrity. So it's not that it's absent from our Catholic institution, because we do have different ways of approaching this, but I think that we can be inspired by the ways that Catholics around the world have been struggling with some of the same issues that confront us as we think through our issues and our relationships to gender and sexuality. Thank you.
Our next panelist, if you haven't had a chance to work with this amazing young professional, Alejandro Covarrubias is the Assistant Director of the Cultural Centers. We have the Cultural Center and the Gender and Sexuality Center on the second or third floor of the University Center. And he works primarily with students, but also faculty and staff, but particularly with students on these very issues. Alejandro is Jesuit trained himself. He got his undergrad at Gonzaga. And then after that, he spent a year in the Jesuit volunteer corps. So he's had a lot of time to really kind of engage these issues, both as a student, as a professional, and now he's doing graduate work here at the university. Alejandro, share a little bit from your perspective as someone that's doing frontline, what I call identity development, that has not only gender and sexuality, but a lot of intersections of those things here at the university with students every day.
Thank you, Mary. I just want to thank all of you and the panelists, and especially Dr. Wardell, for inviting me to be a part of this space. I think oftentimes, as a young professional on campuses, it's nice to feel included and validated in the work that many of my colleagues in the space are doing, so I hope I represent us well while I'm up here. My name is Alejandro Covarrubias. I start there because names are so important. The way that names are said and that are honored, particularly through the lens of gender and sexuality. Particularly for our transgender students who have chosen names that may not be the one that shows up on a transcript, a roster, an email. And the importance to start there with the name. I was confirmed when I was like 16, going through confirmation class. I've been Catholic my entire life. I was born pretty much into the church. And I remember my confirmation name is Peter, the Rock. It's a name that I chose to confirm who I am as a Catholic. For our students who identify as transgender, when they choose their name, different from the one that's on their birth certificate, they confirm their identity and their wholeness, just as I chose Peter to confirm my identity and my wholeness as a Catholic. That name isn't just a nickname, it's a name that identifies them and who they are in their wholeness. So we begin with names, and my name is Alejandro Covarrubias. How I began this work in who I am and understanding the intersectionality of gender and the intersectionality, there's lots of analogies, right, of gender and sexuality within the Jesuit Catholic framework was at Gonzaga University. I took a feminist theology class with an amazing professor named Kate Sejic. It was in that space that, for the first time, I understood what it meant for me to be a man. Mind you, I've been a man my entire life. I've been a cisgender man. If you don't know what cisgender means, that means my gender identity and my expression, so me having a beard right now and a shaved head and a tie and suit on, lines up with my biological sex. And I've never questioned that. So for the first time as a junior in college, I understood that I was a man and what that meant into the world, particularly as a Catholic man. And as I went into Jesuit Volunteer Corps and worked at a homeless shelter, engaging queer youth on the street who were forced out of their families, I began to understand what it means for me to be a straight cisgender man who is Catholic and who is Chicano, Mexican American. One of the beautiful elements of Jesuit tradition that I've been given and gifted by being a part of Jesuit education for over a decade now is this value of cura personalis, the care for the whole person. When I move into spaces on this campus, I have to honor all of my identities and how they show up in a space, particularly as I work with students. We were talking before the panel started that oftentimes with a panel like this, you have tables in front of us and we can put our laptops and notes down, but often those tables create barriers for us. So I appreciate this because it forces me into a level of vulnerability that I'm not really comfortable with right now. Because this isn't my space. My space is with students hanging out in the cultural centers on the 4th floor, sitting around a big table with food that we find at events like this are left over that we bring over. And that's us, by the way. We love it. Making sure the food doesn't go wasted, right? Because otherwise it gets thrown away. That's the space I'm most comfortable in. So to be vulnerable in this space with all of you, without a table in front of me, mirrors what I expect myself to do and what I feel like the Jesuit mission calls me to do as I engage students around their gender and sexuality. I can't show up with students or with my colleagues in the room without naming very upfront that I'm a man and that I'm straight. And this value of cura personalis allows me to sit with students who come out to me as being gay or lesbian or bisexual, who come out to me and saying, you know what, I'm not really sure this whole woman thing is working out for me. This isn't who I am. Can you journey along with me? And what I tell them is, I'm going to do the best I can, even though I'm not part of your community. And I've been formed in this Catholic Jesuit space that doesn't always allow me to see you as you. So I need to be able to deconstruct some of that. So in those wonderful green books that you all have on your table, they have a speech that Father Prevet gave to new faculty. And he spoke about how the words Catholic and Jesuit modify what it means for us to be a university. By adding those two words to what it means for us to be a university, we move from being a value-neutral space to a value-driven space. It also means that we create a Catholic Jesuit context in which academia and student development exists. So students, staff, and faculty, we all come into this space having experiences around what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be treated by Catholics, what it means to be under a system that quite honestly is male dominant and heterosexual dominant. That's the setting in which our students exist in. And many of them, particularly women, particularly transgender students, particularly our LGBTQ students, have experienced negative things with the Catholic Church. They have been told, no, you cannot be this role. You cannot be priest, even though that's what you want to do your entire life. No, you cannot be married. You cannot experience one of the sacraments that we are taught that is blessed among all people. Those are two small, not small examples, very big examples, but two examples that, again, create this Catholic context. So we have to honor that students and us come into this space within that context. And there are folks struggling with that every day. So as I work with students, I try to hold that their identities, and not just their gender identity, not just their sexuality, but their race, their class, their ability, all of that creates their wholeness in them. And because of that wholeness, and because of our mission around social justice, I try to make sure that I'm pushing myself to create this larger, more inclusive space on this campus. Father Prevet, when he talked about this modification of Catholic Jesuit changing what it means to be a university, what that sparked in me was this thought of the head and the heart. And that connection that we talk about in Ignatian spirituality, that we don't move one without the other. I honestly believe that the Catholic tradition, through Jesuit values, can shift what it means for us to be a university. And what it means for us as a university, using Jesuit values of expecting more of our students and of ourselves, through Magis, through social justice, to create more inclusive spaces, can shift what it means to be Catholic. For some folks in the room, that's kind of scary. I want to honor that. For many of us in the room, I'm hoping we're like, yes. Because what does Catholicism look like in the 21st century? How do we live our values in a different way? How can the creation of new knowledge in a university setting, through the values of what it means to be Jesuit, create open spaces for LGBTQ folks, for women, and a broader definition of what it means to be a man and straight within the Catholic context?
Very quickly, Ms. Kate Carter, Assistant Director for Transfer Programs and Transfer Admission. Kate's here because I asked her to bring herself fully. I've actually asked all four of them to bring themselves fully, but I gave a very specific request to her to bring herself fully in the room. I think she's one of the best and biggest advocates for Jesuit education that I know. I've been here 7 years, and I've been so impressed by how she walks and how she talks and how she works with people. So, Ms. Kate Carter.
Thank you, Mary. And I have to say, I'm having a moment of tremendous awe and reverence if I could use some Ignatian terminology, to be in the company of these people and their experience, to be with you all, and to bring my voice, trembling as it is at the moment, to this conversation. My Jesuit education began on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation 35 years ago as a Jesuit volunteer. I didn't go to a Jesuit school as an undergrad, but my Jesuit education began working with Native American children on a reservation in southeast Montana, far, far away from anywhere I had ever been or could imagine myself. But I entered the Jesuit Volunteer Corps with an eye toward a sense of adventure and doing something good for someone. And that has changed my life, my worldview, and the decision to do it has affected everything I've done since that summer of 1978. And so I come here as an admission officer where I have the privilege of inviting students and their families to a place where they might become more of who they are, more of the gifts and the skills and the passions that we know they have. I tell them, we don't need to be convinced of your goodness. One letter of recommendation is sufficient, it's a requirement, but we don't need to be convinced of your goodness. We know that already. That's who we are as an institution. But we want you to be more of your gifts and your skills and your passions as a result of being here. And if this isn't the place, okay. I'm here to talk to you about USF. But if this is not the place, please find the place where you will be more of who you are, inside and out, because of your education. Because here at USF, we say that a Jesuit education isn't just for you. It is for all of the persons who are not here. Who will you encounter in your classrooms, but more importantly here, we say, in your service learning? How will you be more of who you are outside the classroom and more of your gifts and your skills? Because the world needs your gifts and your skills. And what does that have to do with gender and sexuality? We ask ourselves. Our gender and our sexuality is who we are. And we're inviting students at an age when they're learning more about who they are, gender, orientation, academic pursuit, how many times do they change their major or their advisor? You all know that way more than I do. But they're discovering who they are, and we are inviting them into a context to support them in their pursuit of themselves, of God, of truth, of justice, in a place that will support them to do that, to be that, and to bring that to a world that needs to be changed, as we say, to change the world from here so that we can change the world out there. And it is my honor and privilege to be able to talk about this place being a place where you as a student and your family can thrive as persons, as prospective professionals in your faith, whatever that is. And the irony is, for me, sometimes people say, oh, you're a Jesuit? No thanks. They walk away from my table if I'm at a fair, and I'm like, no, come back. We're Jesuit, we're Catholic, but small c Catholic means inclusive. the Jesuits are known for a lot of things, but what do you know about who they are and what they do? They have been educating great people in great cities around the world for centuries, knowing that education is the key to personal transformation. And then we can change the world. We can bring the voice of women and men whose voices aren't at the table. And so I find myself, one of the things that I find myself bringing up often in our admission materials, in our discernment about choosing students, is are we being as inclusive as we want to be? And how do we choose who's at the table? Are we bringing in the diverse class? And I'm not doing this by myself, obviously. I'm one of 25 in our office, but I am a voice. And some of my colleagues will tell you I'm a big voice some days around issues of gender and how we represent, who we put out there as the list of alums that we honor. Where are the women in our profile, in our slides, in our materials? Particularly, where are the women? How are the women involved in this conversation, in this story that we're telling? So, I'm honored, and I thank you for the privilege of being a part of this conversation. It is one of the ways in which I thrive as a person, to be working in admission, to talk about mission and values to prospective students and their families. So I thank you for that.
Let's give them all. So I'd like to open it up to some dialogue. You guys have, first of all, really have been very loving and giving to them by being fully engaged and attentive during, as each one of them shared their commentary and their stories. But I do know that there's probably some questions that you may have for any comment that you heard them say, or something you perhaps came into the room with. And so I would definitely would like to do some engagement at this time. Tell us who you are, tell everybody.
Hi, I'll stand. Yes. My name is Sarah Varela, and I work over in international admission. And I am not a scholar, so this is kind of a question towards our two scholars up here who have done a lot of research. And you mentioned I'm so sorry, I'm not going to get anybody's names right. But you mentioned earlier the questionnaire and the two questions specifically regarding same-sex households, same-sex marriages and same-sex households with children. And I have an uncle who's a missionary, and I often struggle with how the church sometimes reaches out towards new populations, and historically how they kind of merge old traditions with new traditions to kind of melt it into the Catholic tradition. So, although I have a huge reference for Pope Francis right now and everything that he's saying, I'm wondering, is there going to be any sort of kind of takeoff in a negative direction and wanting to bring people in, but not necessarily without the right, I don't know, community support? I don't know how to pose this question other than, I just wonder how supported is it within the general Catholic population to do that work versus kind of proselytizing new blood?
It's difficult often to know anything the Vatican is thinking at any given time, to be honest with you, but it seems to be the case that the Vatican is well aware that rank and file Catholics and their beliefs about these issues do not square with official church teaching, and there is a widening margin between Catholics who are becoming more and more in support of, same-gender marriage and so forth, and a hierarchical position that is quite rigid around them. So it seems that the speculation is for that growing distance to be a foundation for discussion in the next General Synod that will be moving the church forward to address on national levels how the church can begin to open up conversation, shift the tone, whether this is the first step toward a reevaluation of the teaching altogether is probably too optimistic. Certainly anything that I would see as the near future, as much as I would love that. But I think it is a first step. And so I think Francis is very well aware that there is this growing gap, particularly around these issues, and is looking to at least solidify and almost prove that point through these polls, and that will become sources of information for what I'm sure will be very vigorous discussion then at the synods. What they'll do with that information beyond that is very difficult to speculate.
Want to tell people who you are?
Thanks, Mary. My name's Dan Morgan. I teach a course in sociology here this semester. Much of the work that I have done has been with indigenous two-spirit populations in Hawaii and Mahuahine. And many, because of their experiences in secondary school, do not graduate from high school. So we, I would imagine, as an institution, are required to discriminate and not admit them. And I'm just wondering if I would like to be part of a solution to that. I can name people over and over who have done everything from grant writing to hiring staff to opening agencies who cannot get into college because they haven't finished their GED, or they finished their GED and they've gone to a year of community college, but they've run out of money. So that's the solution that I'd like to be part of.
I do think that as a transferred mission counselor, we can talk about ways that students can be ready academically, and transfer students definitely need to be part of a bigger conversation about academic or merit-based aid and financial support. That isn't part of the equation for everybody, but we can certainly talk about ways in which students can be ready to be here, and then we can talk to other people about how merit aid could be available to more and more of them. Thank you.
I think that question as well, and the populations that you're looking at, really brings up the larger question of the intersectionality of identities, right? So we're looking at communities of color, particularly indigenous communities. And what are we doing, again, through our Catholic Jesuit mission, honoring the Catholic history as a part of the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas? So when we talk about this preferential option to protect the Anuim, right, the most marginalized, the most pushed out, those who need the most support, what are we doing as an institution to create spaces for those communities that we ourselves, as not as an institution necessarily, but as part of a larger context, a Catholic context, has been part of the oppression of? So I think there is a certain call for us to create those spaces, to create those scholarships, and to find creative ways to move beyond this university structure. And again, it's that modification. What are we doing as a Jesuit university, a value-driven space that could create those things?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate all of what you shared.
So can you use the mic?
Okay, sure. I could use my booming professor voice. First of all, thank you very much for what you've all very, very heartfully shared. I appreciate it. It seems to me you all, I mean, one of the things that draws all of what you said together is you all sort of spoke of this space that's been created by the university as inclusive and welcoming. And I'm just curious from your own experiences, you know, how could we push the boundaries? What would be particular things you can imagine or maybe that have occurred to you where we could multiply those spaces where this kind of conversation can happen, or expand those spaces, or hold those spaces longer? I'm just curious about sort of going forward, what would be, how could we kind of push farther?
Something? Tonight, we are concluding the sixth in a six-week series of creating a critical open space, particularly for faculty women, and primarily faculty women of color, and it's a program that was called And Still I Rise. I've seen some of the preliminary work that has come out of this series. I initiated it, administratively set up the framework for them, but allowed them to the freedom and the space to do what they felt like they needed to do. And Provost Turpin and a group of deans are going to go and hear what these women have said institutionally, and how what Alejandro's getting at, how have the structures of higher education, academia, trying to go through the tenure and promotion process, what that means for them, and how sometimes they have been left out and left behind. And initially, we already have gotten some feedback that they felt like they have never had a space before to share what their experiences have been at this particular university. So we're going to find out more, but I guess I said that to say this, that we are not there yet as a university in creating these spaces where people feel like they can show up wholly. Why that's the case? There's a multitude of reasons why, but I do think that that's one particular way in which 18 women have gone through this, and I believe they may all identify as women. I'm not sure even how they all identify as, but 18 participants are going to give us some feedback on what their experience has been at USF. Kate?
Sure. In terms of space, my sense is that there's three spaces that I have the most ability to influence right now as chair is my department and its ethos, but most importantly, my classroom and my office space. So the office space is all about creating open sense of welcome to any student who needs to talk on any issue and to sort of be present. But the biggest one of the classroom, I remember interviewing here in November of 2002, and in my teaching philosophy, I was very clear that my biggest point was to create a safe classroom environment so that anybody who comes into my classroom with any particular ideas or ideologies feels that they're able to express them and learn from counterpoints in a safe and non-threatening way. I didn't realize how important that would become when I started teaching issues on homosexuality in the Bible and the potential conflicts of positions that one could have. But the ability for us to seek to create that kind of safety where the goal is not students conform to what is my view on it, but that they come around to the ability to have intelligent discourse around the issue. I'm very confident in the university's position on these issues. I am convinced that we stand, as they say, on the right side of history and that our arguments are compelling. But they have to be presented in a way that those who do disagree don't feel threatened or afraid to express that to a professor who's made very clear his position on the issue. So it requires a certain degree of vulnerability with our students and openness to, this is who I am, here's my position. And how do we then allow for various positions to be protected in safe discourse?
I'll just put in my 2 cents here, and I feel actually the bridge from Vincent's classroom to what Alejandro offers. I think that I just came out of a space at our department meeting where we put aside an hour to talk about what's going on with our pedagogy and how we are approaching and how effective our educational strategies are for our students. And it reminded me again, and before that I was at another meeting of Latin American Studies in which this sort of plethora of events and opportunities was, I mean, it's like the groaning board, okay? Just Latin American Studies, CELASA, we have a lot going on over there. And what I'm continually reminded of here, and I think has been, for me, most directly expressed is through my service learning class, is that we don't hurt for spaces. We just need, from my perspective, to do a better job at demonstrating where those spaces are and making sure the people who can benefit from them get there, because the people of goodwill, the creativity, the imagination, and I have to be honest, having been at other institutions, the resources we put behind some of these spaces, they're at least adequate. What we need to do is, I don't know, in that terrible terminology, exploit them more. So I feel that actually, certainly in bringing how can we interface more with the community around us, whether that community is our very local neighborhood community, whether it's San Francisco, the wider Bay Area, whether it's national, whether it's international. A lot of that can be done through our service connections and through those conversations, because those aren't one-way conversations. Those are the way that the university can learn from the community while we express to the community, listen, this is our hermeneutics. This is what we stand for. And to just, lack of a better word again, selling that, right? Or showing that so that these spaces can be more fully utilized.
I would also certainly the office space is a great place to have conversations, and also I would challenge all of us when we're sitting around a table to look at who's here and who isn't here, and why aren't they here, and what are we going to do about it? Because that's what I tell our students, our prospective students, that our education is about learning more about who's not here, whose voice is not represented. I'm very fortunate as a Catholic out partnered with a woman. I'm very free to be who I am here. I'm partnered with somebody who's not free to be who she is where she works. What are we going to do about that? She doesn't work here, but but are there students? Are there colleagues? Are there partners, community partners, who aren't free to be who they are? And we are called to invite them to the table.
And just to comment on this idea of space as well, and trying to bring it to the folks who aren't here, the students, and things that I've learned from students is that students exist in the in-between space. So what does that mean? Students exist in the intersectionality. Students don't exist in binaries. They don't exist in this, okay, this is a safe classroom, this isn't a safe classroom. This is a safe professor, this isn't a safe professor. This is a safe, student affairs professional, this isn't okay, sometimes you're safe, sometimes you're not. Sometimes this classroom is good, and sometimes I leave feeling victimized and traumatized. Students exist in that both and every day. So I think it's our ability and our humility as folks in this room to listen to our students. Because our students are playing with gender and gender identity and gender expression in beautiful ways. Ways that I can't even conceive, but I'm trying to learn. Our students are playing with sexual fluidity and identity in ways that I cannot conceive because of my own lenses. But I'm learning from them on how to explore who I am as a straight person. I'm learning to understand what it means for me to be a man more and more as I see students playing with gender and trying to create their own spaces. And I think that's an element that we need to pay more attention to, is listening and asking and inviting our students to the table about their in-between spaces. Because they're finding it, they're creating it, and they're creating it in random places. And I'm talking about they're creating it on the bus, on the 5, going from here to their service learning space. They're creating it, sitting together, seeing someone else in that bus play with gender and saying, maybe that's me too. So the in-between space isn't just the classroom, the service spot, it's the bus line, it's Clement Street, it's the Castro, it's the Mission, it's the spaces where our students occupy that we don't think of as academic or service, but where they're learning the most.
I'd like to invite Provost Turpin.
I have such a loud voice, I probably don't need this, but I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of you. This has been a tremendous opportunity for me to listen and learn from you. It was very powerful. I found myself very emotional, actually, listening to all of you. And just to, hopefully collectively affirm this work and thank the Council on Jesuit Mission for this kind of session. I mean, this is really incredible sharing and dialogue that's going on here, and also the Diversity Office. And I hope it shows a commitment from the university that we really are trying to create space for this kind of collective work and community and dialogue. So I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of you and to Mary for putting, and to the council for all of us coming together to have these kinds of conversations. So that's it for me. Thanks.
I think, is there any other final thoughts?
I have one.
Go ahead, Kate.
This is a quote that I thought I would start with, so I'd like to finish with it.
Okay.
It's quick and easy.
Okay.
The search for self, for wisdom, for love, for truth, for justice, for God is strenuous and unending. We need good companions in order to persevere in it. In good company, in a community of conviction, the quest never loses its relevance, its urgency, or its savor. Sorry, not savior, savor. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon.